Thank you, Angie. Good morning. As Angie noted, my name is David Paulaskas with Realty Trust Group. Some brief background of my experience. I've been in the design and construction industry for just over 25 years, and the bulk of my experience and my time in that sector has been in healthcare, both design and construction, and also some time on the owner side for a health system within the Chicago area. There's been a substantial shift over the past few decades of how and where patients are being diagnosed and treated, as well as the maintenance of their health. We've seen medical care go from hospital-centric to outpatient facilities near the hospital campus, to ambulatory surgery centers and facilities that are more embedded in the communities that they serve. This is part of what I think that Angie and I started having discussions about that would be of interest to this group. In addition, telemedicine is now challenging the need for some patients to even step outside of their home. So there's a continued struggle in this evolution of care to improve patient outcomes and quality of life, especially in regard to access of care for those in underserved and remote communities, as well as within the environment of the hospitals and outpatient facilities within our communities. The changes in how healthcare is administered has put significant financial pressure on hospitals, health systems, and physician practices. The environments that patients are treated in and the cost to them, construction, maintenance, operational costs, these are associated consequences that we need to be cognizant of. This is what I hope to focus on today. So a few of these topics that we want to go through, we want to start off talking about some of just the economics of where we stand, both in general and in the healthcare environment. We want to talk about the safety of patients and visitors and the healthcare providers. We want to touch a little bit on improving patient satisfaction scores. We believe that there's not only a clinical input to this, but also all of the associated and support areas that, again, support these healthcare providers. In addition to that, we want to talk about some of the day-to-day operations and some of the efficiencies that can really affect the finances and outcomes to patients. So just to start off, I think we want to talk about, sorry about that. I want to talk about just some of the economics from a maintenance and construction standpoint that I'm familiar with in my sector. So one of the things that we look at is there's obviously been inflationary problems in the economy, and especially within the construction sector over the past few years. Taking COVID and the pandemic out of that, because that's really kind of skewed a lot of things. Just some highlights to show you how costs have really been impacted over the past few years. In December of 21, there was an 11% increase in average healthcare building construction over the year past. Between January of 22 and January of 23, we saw almost an 18% increase in overall average healthcare building construction costs. Now, this varies, obviously, depending on where you are in the country and the complexity of the projects that are happening. The other things that we want to note are just some of the construction industry inputs that do impact those costs. For example, we look at things like the healthcare structures in general, the overall constructability piece of it. We saw between December of 20 and 21, we saw a 20% increase year over year. January of 22 to 23, we saw a 4% increase. The things that are really impacting some of these costs that we see, sorry about that. Some of the things that we see overall is, diesel fuel. This impacts everything from trucking to construction equipment. In December 20 to 21, we saw a 54% increase. That obviously cascades into all of the deliveries and materials that we see within the construction industry. You're starting to see a trend now. You're starting to see why construction costs are really starting to go through the roof. Overall building construction projects or products. cement, making concrete, gypsum products, steel products. We saw, for instance, we saw cement products go 4%. We saw last year, January 22 to 23, we saw an increase of 17% in concrete product costs. Gypsum products, drywall, underlayment, things like that, that go into the finishes of hospitals and healthcare systems. December 20 to 21, we saw a 23% increase in those product costs. Just last year, 22 to January of 23, we saw an 11% increase. The interesting thing that we saw is that steel products, we saw 128% increase. Not to say that there's all bad things happening here, but we saw 128% increase between December of 20 and 21. Last year, we saw between January of 22 and 23, we saw a 30% decrease in those costs. Copper, aluminum, we saw a 4 and 6% decrease last year in January 22 to 23, where the year prior, we saw 23, almost 30% increases in copper and aluminum. So what the intent here of what we're trying to show is that while overall costs are up, there are sort of these microeconomics that are happening within each of these sort of construction product costs that can affect this. We'll talk a little more about that later of how that impacts that. Construction labor. I know that, even within the healthcare sector, labor costs obviously are going up. There's a shortage of labor. We're seeing construction labor total compensation. We saw a 3.5% increase December 20 to 21. January of 22 to 23, we saw a 4% increase. So we continually see these prices going up. What does this mean? Well, I would say that when we budget projects overall, in normal times, we would consider a 3, maybe 5% increase year over year in what we would consider escalation costs, normal inflationary costs. We've seen 12, 15, 18% overall inflationary increases year over year over the past several years. So really the takeaway from what we're talking about here is that there's still a lot of volatility and uncertainty. And so the predictability of budgets, the predictability of strategic plans that hospital systems have is in jeopardy. So we're trying to take more of a episodic look at budgets. We're trying to take a look, instead of saying general costs across the board, we're trying to take more of a project by project and more of a region by region look at how these costs are impacted. So let's take a look at, So let's take a look at some of the healthcare environment itself, some of the economics of project types within healthcare. These can be really broken down into minor renovations and appearance upgrades within the hospital. These are probably more of the day-to-day or sort of the refreshes that we see hospitals taking a look at. These are paint, carpet, maybe some light fixture changeouts, things like that. Really just the refreshes to keep the facility looking new, looking well maintained. These can range $8, $10, $12 a square foot, depending on the expectation of this. Keep in mind that when we talk about some of these costs of square foot costs and we talk about overall averages, these aren't meant to be estimates. These are really averages that are taken from across the country. These are by region, by local area. This is also taken by project type that can vary greatly. So you have to kind of take some of these costs with a grain of salt. It's really more of a conversational piece to sort of give an order of magnitude of how we approach some of these projects. So getting back to some of these project types, we look at things like these minor renovations. We also look at infrastructure and energy. These may be upgrades of air handlers and pumps and air handling units, that major infrastructure that's within the building, major renovations and additions. Some of these are renovations to floors within the occupied spaces. This may also include some small additions to some of the facilities for increased service lines, added service lines, just some more space that's really needed. It may also not be true clinical space. It may be more medical office or administrative space also. New construction. This may include new patient towers, may include surgical additions, diagnostics, outpatient, on-campus, off-campus buildings that are happening. Each one of these really has a significant impact on what costs are. So when we talk about construction costs, things like renovations, that may be some building partition walls, that may be new offices, it may be some new clinical space, doors, finishes, things like that. Those have a significantly different impact to the cost than, say, an infrastructure or energy project where major equipment purchases are being made, generators or switchgear or, like we said earlier, air handling units. These can have dramatic impacts, both on time and money within a project. New construction. Sometimes we'll hear that small additions to buildings have a higher dollar per square foot cost associated with them than, say, a larger project, inpatient tower addition, things like that. Some of that may be associated with what we would just consider an economy of scale. This would be that the larger the project, sometimes there is an efficiency as to what those costs really are, as to saying that you have these smaller projects, which have limited labor or material time associated with them. So again, as you look at costs within a project, you have to be cognizant of the fact that it's not, that there is no one size fits all. There is no dollar per square foot that really cascades across all project types. So this is where, getting the right partners on board and the right teams to look down the road is extremely important. The other thing that we want to talk about is in some of the renovation projects that we look at and some of the impacts, we want to look at things like existing conditions. Within a lot of hospitals, especially those that were built in the 50s and 60s, we're seeing a lot of that where end of serviceable life, we're starting to see that a lot of hospital systems are starting to do new additions or replacement towers to their facilities. There are existing conditions that exist within the facilities. This would include that there's old infrastructure that's there. A lot of these older buildings do have problems. There's environmental concerns. We talk about things like lead and asbestos that needs to be remediated within a lot of these facilities. So make no mistake about it that due diligence for existing conditions can be a significant cost to some of these construction projects. One of the things too that when we talk about new projects, so a lot of times costs are really associated with the building itself and the service lines that are there, the medical equipment that goes into it, and the finishes. One of the things that we need to be cognizant of are the site conditions that are there, the land that the buildings actually sit on. So a lot of times, sometimes you do get lucky and you do have conditions that are favorable for a building, good soils, good water table, things like that. The other thing that can really drive costs significantly higher are unsuitable soils that won't support the foundation. So some of that has to be removed and replaced with other materials. Those are significant costs, I think, that a lot of administrations look at, and they can't quite wrap their head around the costs that start to really drive some of these projects. The other thing is, and I'm sure a lot of hospitals and health systems have run into this before, whenever there's a major undertaking of a project within a community, there is usually an appearance and also community requirements. A lot of board meetings, a lot of negotiations as to how this new facility or this significant expansion of the facility will impact the community. Traffic, appearance, how it looks, noise, smell, light, all of those types of things. So some of those things will drive costs of some of these projects. So one of the things I think that we need to also talk about here is when we talk about some of the key results. Now, these vary obviously depending on the administration and the project type, but one of the things we want to talk about is patient satisfaction when we're getting into some of these new projects. Comfort and perception of the patients that you're serving. Clinical outcomes. Obviously, safety and quality is paramount to the patients that are served by each one of these health systems or hospitals. So these are important factors that need to be addressed during the design of it. We talk about brand strength. So as we see a lot of consolidation within the industry, smaller hospitals being acquired by larger health systems, you know, the challenge for some larger health systems is how do you have a continuity between facilities? How do you have that brand that's recognizable to patients, whether they go within their area or whether they travel to another facility with the same name and that same brand? Brand strength is very important. And some of the things that come along with that is familiarity, the signage, the feel, how a person is intaked into the facility. Those are all important. And to get those, to get that familiarity and continuity between each of the facilities, there's a design piece to that, that we have to be aware of. The other thing we need to look at is operational costs. So during some of these projects, during the design, there's obviously always a cost issue that comes to that. But in selection of things like finishes and equipment for the engineering team, it's very important.
Hey, David, can you switch to your computer audio? Your headphones just died.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry about that. I apologize. So some of those operational costs that really need to be looked at from a design standpoint up front. So the takeaway from really this page is to say, look, as a facility and an administration, establish project goals early. Incorporate mission and values into the project. Those are important from day one so that at the end of the project, all of those goals and all of those missions can really be met. So Angie, I think we're to our first polling question.
Terrific. Moderator, if you'll release the first polling question. Our first polling question of this session 1 on day 2 is: average dollar per square foot construction cost of a new 3-story hospital is, please select one, $150.26 per square foot, $322.27 per square foot, or $419.18 per square foot. We will watch the number of responses that are coming through to the poll. We would love to hear from all of you, but please know if you are not seeking CPE today as a CPA, then your participation in the poll is of course optional. But for the CPAs in the audience, we do need to hear from you. Also, if you're having any trouble answering the poll, please put your answer in the question pane. That way that we can track your attendance and your engagement in the session for that CPE credit to be in accordance and compliance with NASBA requirements. If you will, Matthew, go ahead and release the answers to the poll. And back to you, David.
Thanks, Angie. So here's something that's interesting. When we look at costs, and again, we touched on this earlier, the correct answer is really $419 a square foot. That's what and that's off of a building design construction survey that was taken back in April. Now, again, I would be cautious, and I would have caution to everyone who's looking at this, that is an average cost. That's an average cost depending on, across the United States. It also is an average cost of complexity, from very, very simple to very, very complex. So 419 may be a great mark for a certain project. We also see projects that go way higher than that. Some go down to a $300 level. It depends on complexity. It also depends on full build out of those spaces and what's really required at each of those facilities. Now, that's just a construction cost. So I would also caution that too. When having early discussions, there's a lot of numbers that tend to get thrown out. There's construction costs, there's design costs, there's soft costs, equipment costs, furniture costs. All of these things really go into a total project budget. And those those include everything from all of the tangibles that you can see and touch and feel, to all of the intangibles. There's a lot of inspection costs. There's a lot of the review costs that go into that, permitting costs. So recent examples of total project costs, and these are all just from news articles that are out there. Obviously, these adjust as they go forward. Some projects increase in scope, others get delayed. But just for example, University of Chicago, they're doing a new freestanding cancer care center. It's about 500,000 square feet. And the listed cost right now is about $633 million. So for a total project cost, it's about $1,200 a square feet. Ohio State, 1.9 million square feet. It's a huge project. It's obviously at a major academic center, almost $1.8 billion at $942 a square foot. As you can see, this touches on what we had mentioned earlier, that there is an economy of scale. Some of that, what's the difference? Well, it's almost, it's more than twice the size. The square foot cost is a little lower. Some of that is just due to specialty, but some of that is actually due to both location and economy of scale. Vanderbilt University, recently a 500,000 square foot inpatient tower, $500 million, $1,000 a square foot. So again, these are total project costs. And when you look at this, it's also very important to understand what goes into those project costs. Again, soft costs and furniture and equipment, along with the actual building construction. So one of the things that we talk about as we're talking about some of these economics, and really the title of this seminar is really the financial effects of what we talk about. The first question that we're always asked on projects or strategic plans is, how much does it cost? And there's a cost to value conversation that really needs to be had. This is what touches on the goals and really values of each administration as they undertake projects. What we want to start talking about now, though, is we want to start talking about how the built environment within healthcare, as soon as you walk through the door, actually before you even walk in the door, as you're driving to the facility, as you're parking in the parking lot or parking garage, and you're making your way to the front door, the unintended consequences that are here. 250,000 people die from medical errors. Third leading cause of death in 2018, I believe that was right behind heart disease and cancer. Medical errors, approximately $20 billion a year. The reason I throw these up on the screen is that I think when we hear this, we talk about physician or clinical errors that occur within the environment. I would challenge that and say that there are other factors, obviously, that come into play here. And some of those things that come in that we really need to talk about is we start to talk about all the other impacts that we have. Let's see here, sorry. are the other impacts that we have within the built environment. Hospital-acquired infections within the environment. 1 in 31 patients contracts one infection. Now, we talk about things from a clinical standpoint of infections during procedures. I would say that the responsibility of that also lies, and the accountability of that lies with facilities management, engineering, and design and construction within the built environment. Surgical site infections account for 20% of all hospital-acquired infections. You can see the numbers here with $3.3 billion in costs, extended hospital stays, costs of hospitalizations that drive those costs. Those are not just clinical problems. Those are the environment problems. So let's talk about things like water quality. Bacteria and Legionella can be aerosolized into the air. This can cause infections in patients, and this can be due directly to either poor maintenance within the facility. This can also be caused by construction and maintenance activities within there. Air quality, contaminants. One of the big factors during construction is we talk about dust. We talk about cross-contamination. We talk about pressurization. For instance, we talk about in occupied spaces within hospitals. We talk about renovation projects that are either on the same floor or within an adjacent space above or below active patient care areas. We talk about pressurization. We want to keep all those contaminants, all that dust, all of those issues. We want to keep those within that construction space and not send them out into the clinical spaces. At times, we've seen where this happens. There are documented situations where either poor quality control, not enough oversight, bad planning and communication can cause contamination within patient care areas. Volume of air changes per hour. This, when we're working on infrastructure within the facility, these can have dramatic impacts, especially in critical areas such as NICUs or surgical suites. Maintenance. So we talk about things like water treatment, and not just on domestic and potable water, but we talk about things like cooling towers. We talk about sewage and mold. We talk about sinks that leak. We talk about sinks that tend to back up or don't flow very well. This does have a tendency to spill over onto adjacent surfaces, can cause mold, can cause bacteria in the air. That becomes airborne, and then we start to move into these areas where we start to see infections start to increase. So it's extremely important when we start maintenance or construction projects, we always involve infection prevention early on. There's a thing, and I'm sure most people are aware of it, but there is a risk mitigation tool that's used that's called an ICRA. So it's an infection control risk assessment. And this tool is used at the beginning of every project, not just when construction starts, but we use this tool to say, how much of an impact is this project going to have? Is it a small project? Is it a very small time frame? Is it a larger project that involves a lot of demolition and a lot of disturbance within the facility? And how long is it going to take? So the longer that those projects go, the higher the chance and more risk that's associated with these projects. So we talk about hazards within the healthcare environment. I consider hazards to be very disruptive to care. That's what those hazards would be. Talk about security and access control. Obviously, most hospitals want to have an open door. They want to be welcoming to their patients. They don't want to be walking through metal detectors. They don't want to be walking through doors and doors that are secured that they have to wait to get through. That's not conducive to a healing environment. However, we do live in times where security and access control are very important. So we have to be cognizant of how circulation happens from the front door all the way through the facility. These things need to get involved and integrated into the design of new facilities. We talk about preventative maintenance. preventative maintenance is one of those things that most facility and engineering departments, they have preventative maintenance programs in place. They know that they have to exercise valves, and they know that they have to look at things, and when things start to deteriorate, or they know that there's the end of a serviceable life to a piece of equipment, that they do need to schedule replacement of those things or repairs. And a lot of those things happen on the electrical, plumbing, and mechanical sides. One of the things that, if preventative maintenance is not implemented within the facility, we look at things like emergency repairs. We look at utility failures, and I always say that nothing good happens at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and that's usually when most of these systems break down. When there's a scarce amount of materials available, and also labor available at those times. So preventative maintenance is extremely important. When we're scheduling maintenance, though, one of the problems that we do have in hospitals is that there's typically no off hours, right? We can't come in at night, and we can't do those repairs. So what we do have to do is we do have to communicate with service lines and managers, department heads, to say, when are those low volumes? When are they not in operation? And if they are in operation 24/7, how do we mitigate those schedules, and how do we work around so that patient care can continue to be provided and revenue can be generated? A lot of times, we tend not to bring those conversations up when we talk about maintenance or construction projects, but revenue of a hospital is what's paying for this, and it's important. So we want to make sure we keep those revenue sources flowing, so that the hospital and health systems can continue to provide for their patients. Event recovery. This is something that when we talk about emergency management within facilities, we talk about things like fire and weather and floods and utility interruptions. These are important things to be prepared for, have materials ready, and have the right resources available from a labor standpoint. I put an example on here that, we do hear about broken sprinkler heads occasionally in hospitals. Sometimes that's due to, in the upper Midwest, where I'm originally from, we do talk about low temps during the winter. Occasionally these sprinkler heads do freeze and break. We also have situations where contractors are working or maintenance facility are working, and they accidentally break a head off. Now it varies obviously from facility to facility, but a broken sprinkler head can produce 25 gallons of water a minute. By the time someone realizes that that's broken, someone can call the engineering department, someone can respond to that, let's just say 4 to 6 minutes, sometimes longer. When you really do the math on that, that could be 150 gallons of water on the floor, uncontrolled, into patient care areas. And if you're on an elevated floor, gravity takes over, and it does start to go to other floors. So cleanup of that and mitigation of contaminants and caring for your patients, it can be very, very disruptive. So preparation for your response crews is extremely important. I put behavioral health in here as a discussion point, and I put it in there specifically because in inpatient care units, we all know that behavioral health and funding has become a problem, and it's been a problem throughout the United States. These inpatient care units obviously have a specialized and sort of different set of issues that have to be dealt with. One of the things that we talk about is that when we're in general patient care areas, we try to, as teams from facilities, construction, or engineering move through, they're cognizant of contaminants and noise and vibration. But in inpatient care units for behavioral health, it's important with regard to access control into those spaces. It's extremely important with regard to tools being left behind or materials being left unattended. These are things that are extremely important to be cognizant of within those units that can cause obviously serious harm or sentinel events to patients being cared for within those units, and the financial ramifications of that, as well as just the public perception of incidents in a facility, can be extremely detrimental. One of the other things that we talk about too is when we talk about situations in hospitals where we talk about fire alarms or we talk about access control. And it depends on the jurisdiction, it depends on the inpatient units, but you know, in facilities where fire alarms trigger, there's a situation in an event sequence that's called fail safe, which means that in the event of a fire or in the event of a fire alarm, occupants of that facility can have free access to get out of the building. So secured areas, exit doors that are locked, things like that will fail safe, which means that they can get out of the building unencumbered. In behavioral health areas, it's a little different. Some of those have fail safe, others have fail secure because they want to be able to secure the unit in the event of an emergency, which also takes a lot of staff and labor. So it's things to be aware of within those units. One of the other things that has come to into the fold, and not even recently, probably over the past several years, even a decade, is that the transfer of patients from general community hospitals or medical centers into behavioral health facilities dedicated to that treatment of patient. Emergency departments are becoming overwhelmed with observation and holding of behavioral health patients until they can be transferred to another facility. I understand, and by all means, this is outside of my my purview, but in discussions, we know that, you know, being in observation units versus being able to admit and how long patients can be held in these departments is of a real concern. So these are some of the things that when renovations are taking place within the emergency departments during that design, or new facilities are being built, behavioral health continues to be a real challenge. Also, how do you dedicate behavioral health spaces within emergency departments and some of those clinical care areas, but that can also be used as a flexible space for general patient use? So, construction and maintenance activities. We always think about construction projects and maintenance projects as the physical act of doing those things, physically building the spaces, maintaining those spaces with facilities and engineering personnel. Planning long before a shovel hits the ground or anyone decides that they're going to show up and start doing demolition within the facility is extremely important. I can't emphasize enough the key to communication, not only with the planning, design, and construction teams, but also with administration, all the key stakeholders. That includes infection prevention. We had talked about that earlier, how important that is early on in the process. Department heads directly involved with those projects. Adjacent departments are also extremely important. We're going to be working in spaces next to other departments that may not have any implications to that project or that maintenance program, but noise and vibration and just circulation in and around their departments could have an impact on patient care. Support services, environmental services, engineering, security, volunteer services. We also see that, you know, during projects within hospitals and health system, medical centers, is that a lot of times circulation, normal circulation throughout the facility can get disrupted, which means longer travel times, which means possibly not good lines of sight down corridors, abrupt turns that we have to have because we have temporary partitions up. These are things that may require additional FTEs or additional volunteers to help patients navigate through the facility. Emergency shutdowns happen when events occur, but for general maintenance and general construction projects, the schedule and the coordination has to happen at least weeks, several weeks in advance, if not months in advance. Patient care is too important, as well as the care providers not being sort of sideswiped by these projects that come in. So scheduling way in advance is important. You know, one of the things involving a lot of these team members is there's a pride in ownership. Everyone wants to solve problems in their day and in their jobs. So one of the things that we want to do is during planning of maintenance or construction projects, we do want to involve the right people, and we do want to involve those who are going to be the end users within those spaces. Designers can only take it so far. I would challenge and say even C-suite can only take it so far. The people that can really bring a lot of value, and sometimes the most value, are those who are the end users within these spaces. They are working in there day in and day out, and they understand some of the nuances along with some of the workarounds that they've had to do. The worst thing I think that can happen in a new project is to take bad habits or bad process and just move that into a new space. There's an inefficiency that comes from that. It also includes that there may the additional FTEs that may be required in certain clinical areas may not be needed because there's just been workarounds or poor circulation within those spaces before. KPIs, again, these obviously vary depending on facilities and medical centers and systems. But one of the things I think we want to talk about is medication and dosing errors. You know, some of these I have taken just from history, but you know, we talk about medication errors. A lot of this is not just from the clinical standpoint, but I say that's due to distractions. You know, in a lot of clinical areas now, or even in pharmacies, there's obviously these sterile environments, sterile not being from an infection standpoint, but sterile being just from a focus standpoint, so that the clinicians and the pharmacists who are dosing these medications aren't distracted or bothered by noise or vibration or interruptions. Errors related to anesthesia, again, when working in and around a surgical suite, disruptions such as noise and vibration can distract within the surgical suite. Hospital-acquired infections, contamination from water and air quality, delayed diagnosis. This can happen in a lot of facilities where there's construction going on, there's maintenance going on, there's utility interruptions, where clinicians and physicians and nurses, they are delayed because they either have to travel further, some services are not available for a certain amount of time because of shutdowns, and that can really lead to a delay in treatment. So we do have to be cognizant of that, and we want to communicate that to clinicians early on. I would say the takeaway from this is that we really want to plan, communicate, and schedule everything that can happen possibly in advance with as much time as possible for the clinicians. So Angie, I think we're to polling question number 2.
Terrific. Moderator, if you will open up the question. Question number 2 in session number 3, or the first session of day 2 for Summer Symposium, is: which is in the top 5 non-compliant, most challenging Joint Commission requirements flagged during surveys? And the reference period was January 22 through December of 2022. Please select 1, disinfection and sterilization of medical equipment, mitigation of risks that pose self-harm, for example, anti-ligature, drug label integrity, expiration, contraindications, or dosage. Interior spaces are safe and suitable for patient care. Or your last option, critical area contaminants, filtration, temperature, humidity, pressure. You have a few more seconds to answer. Thank you for participating in our poll. We're going to leave it open a few seconds longer. If you're having any trouble at all answering our poll, if you will put your answer in the question pane, that way our CPE reviewer can note your attendance and participation in our poll for CPE credit. If you're not seeking CPE credit, please feel free to answer and participate anyway. We like to hear from you and ensure that our polls are interesting and full of different perspectives. And with that, I think we should close the poll, moderator, and turn things back over to David so he can see the results.
Thank you, Angie. So this is a bit of a trick question that we had. Let me see here. It was all of the above. So the reason I had put this in here for the Joint Commission survey is that I believe that each one of these does have a direct relation to the physical environment within the hospital system. So infection prevention and control activities, that, you know, we talk about sterilization of medical equipment and devices. This was the flag that Joint Commission had come up with. I look at that as infrastructure. If maintenance or construction activities are impacting the utilities that are serving sterilization equipment, steam, hot water, electricity, all of this can be impacted by that. Hospital conducts environmental risk assessments for the physical environment that could be used to attempt suicide. We talked about this a little bit earlier about the behavioral health units and care. Tools that are left behind, design that is not compliant with anti-ligature requirements. All of these things can have a direct impact on these survey results. Medication, we talked about this fairly in depth. I believe that, you know, distraction and disruption to medical professionals who are dosing and distributing medication, any of the activities from maintenance or construction can have a profound impact on this. And this comes back to coordination, letting everyone know what's happening in the hospital during these construction or maintenance activities is important, so they know what to expect. Interior spaces, this is a pretty broad statement. Interior spaces that meet the needs of the patient population and are safe and suitable for care. You know, a lot of this comes from where things are stored, the condition of the environment that's there. You know, do they have all the utilities? Is it clean? Is everything in good repair, both finishes and equipment? Airborne contaminants in critical care areas. You know, we talk about things like surgical suites and airflow. We talk about NICUs. We talk about oncology suites. These are all extremely critical environments that we know can have profound and detrimental impacts on patient care for facilities. So I know we're starting to run a little tight on time, but we want to talk about HCAHPS scores. And again, I think that there is a huge amount of accountability and responsibility on those that maintain and work within the healthcare environment that are non-clinical and non-clinicians. Care from nurses and doctors. Obviously, this is a clinical piece during those surveys, but I would also challenge and say, nurses, physicians, and everyone within that sort of patient care arena, disruptions, communication, when it's human behavior, and I think reactions to that, you know, a nurse or a physician that come in that had to be late because the parking lot was under construction, or they walked through the front door and their normal course of circulation through the facility was interrupted by partitions or detours through the facility. That impacts people. It gives everyone. It's a human response that there's anxiety, there could be anger, there's frustration. That getting conveyed into the patient care environment onto patients is a real thing. And I think we need to be cognizant of that when we're doing these projects and we're communicating not just with the specific departments that we're dealing with, but also with the entire hospital. We talk about the hospital environment, cleanliness, noise and disruptions, and you know, these types of things when they specifically call out in the survey, you know, where the bathroom's clean, things like that. Construction activities and maintenance activities can have a huge impact on this. We try to keep dust to a minimum. We try to keep materials out of patient care areas, but all of this, even if it's not within the specific room or area of a patient, as they're traversing the facility and they're circulating through, they see things. That's a perception, I think, that can get conveyed into these HCAHPS scores. Overall hospital ratings, same thing. the experience and perception. Some of that's clinical, some of that is just going through the hospital. If patients are frustrated because they can't get somewhere efficiently, they can't move through, they had to park in a far spot of the parking lot or parking garage. While those aren't necessarily one-to-one for their patient care, it does, in fact, it does impact how they see the hospital and how they perceive their care. One of the things that we talked about, or that I've seen, is admission through the ED. This has become, obviously, over the past several years and really decade, the emergency departments have really become the front door to the hospitals. And as designs change and renovations happen and new facilities are built, can the overall emergency departments, can they accommodate both emergent and non-emergent patients? The other piece of this is really pediatric care within those facilities. As a parent, you bring your child there, and if you can't get to where you're going, and there's backlogs and there's waiting rooms, and how you navigate the facility from there, those are all things I think that can affect your emotional and your mental health as you get through the facilities. And while I know that that's a bit of a stretch from what the HCAP questions are really surveying, I do believe that it does impact patients and caregivers, their overall perception of what's going on. So again, survey goals, we're looking for quality of care of patients, we're looking for accountability, and we're looking for the patient's perspective from a maintenance and a facility standpoint, construction standpoint. All of these goals can be really affected by the activities that we're doing within the facility, within the physical environment. So as we start to wrap up here, we want to talk about just some of the operational efficiencies that we've talked about. Energy consumption within the hospital, hospitals and healthcare are one of the largest consumers of energy, both from light and water. I believe I took this off of the EPA website and what they consider to be an energy use intensity calculation. We won't get into the details of that, but the only thing that beats healthcare right now, outside of specific industrial applications, is food sales and service, entertainment. Really, healthcare uses a lot of electricity. It uses a lot of water. It uses a lot of resources to run day to day. And especially in older facilities, there is a struggle to try to cap how much money is spent on energy use, both from a direct standpoint and also just an indirect standpoint of just wasteful energy use that's not really going into direct patient care. So some of the energy uses that we talk about lighting, we talk about heating and cooling, we talk about those. So when we start to talk about that, we talk about how we repair and how we replace some of those things. We talk about automation. We talk about changing out of light bulbs. We talk about how we use less energy and how we curb some of those life cycle costs and operational expenses. One of the calculations that's out there is really cheaper upfront costs on things like equipment and fixtures versus the long-term return on investment for those. Are the operational costs higher or lower with the selection of some of the products and equipment? So it's an important calculation, I think, that needs to be determined upfront early on. So Angie, our third polling question is here.
Absolutely. So polling question number 3, moderator, if you'll pull up our third polling question for this session. What is the typical lifespan of an LED light bulb? Please select 1. 1,200 hours, 8,000 hours, 25,000 hours, or lastly, an infinite lifespan. We'll allow you a few seconds to answer the poll. We'll allow David a few seconds to catch his breath and take a drink of water. And David, please don't worry about time. You have until about 11:05. So you're good on time. Let's look at the polling results coming in. We've got quite a few. Again, if you're having any trouble answering the poll, Please put your problem in the question pane within GoToWebinar, and our CPE reviewer will note that you are having difficulty with that. And even if you are not getting CPE credit today, we'd love to hear from you and have a good poll. I think we've got a good number of participants that have answered. So moderator, if you'll release the poll and let David see the results here.
Excellent. 48% were correct. It's 25,000 hours for a lifespan of an LED bulb. Now, keep in mind that, that obviously takes into account how many times it's turned on and off, the conditions that it's in. Hospitals are pretty high use and pretty destructive environments to a lot of materials. But on average, it's about 25,000 hours. And that the chart here kind of compares to CFLs, which are really fluorescent bulbs, and then incandescents. Incandescents really being the most inefficient use of energy for lighting. A lot of incandescents are really going away, but there is also the concern from a lot of facilities of, especially in older facilities, if we change from incandescents or fluorescents to LEDs, there's obviously the upfront cost to do that, and how much value is there. That's a pretty easy calculation for most engineering firms to do, and as well as probably engineering personnel within the facilities to really see what those upfront costs are and what that return on investment is. So as we start to finish up here, I think that when we talk about maintenance and really just design of facilities, we start to talk about things of material selections. Architects do a great job, and interior designers do a great job of figuring out how these facilities should look and trying to meet the needs of administrations and what that branding really is. But there is sort of a finite selection process that comes down to material selections. Some things look really, really nice and they're great to have. The question becomes durability. How often does it have to be maintained? Does it need to be repaired? Is it really, does it taking the hit from a patient cart or a wheelchair, will it survive that, or does it need to be replaced? Those are the types of things that really need to be looked at in a lot of facilities. And some areas are nicer. Front lobbies, some of the waiting areas take less of use than, say, a patient care corridor or an emergency department. Serviceable life, we talked about this earlier. Depending on what the upfront costs are of both materials and equipment, you have to look at that and then say, okay, how much maintenance is this going to require? How many FTEs do we really have to dedicate over the course of a month or a year to help maintain some of this equipment, and what is really the predictability of this equipment and material. Equipment, parts, and availability. I think any hospital system would know that supply chain has become an extremely important topic, and probably almost every day a discussion point about whether things are domestic or imported. And where these things come from. No different on the construction and maintenance side either. Wallpaper, paint, finishes, light fixtures, plumbing fixtures, and really just overall repair parts have become a really, really important piece to say, how expensive are these parts and can we get them as soon as we need them? It's become a very important topic. So these are the things that we want to have discussions about very, very early on in the design process. Construction and facility upgrades. We talked about this a little bit earlier to kind of start to wrap this up. We talked about just access. Again, the frustration from not only patients visiting a facility, but also from caregivers, clinicians, and really all the support staff within a hospital. It's very important to make sure that access and circulation through the facility during construction activities are well broadcast and communicated to everyone there. Nobody wants to be late for work. It's also important that obviously during the treatment of patients and diagnostics, timing is of the essence. So we want to make sure that we're not increasing those time frames and potentially delaying treatment to patients. One of the things too is that police and fire and EMS We want to be cognizant of that, and we want to communicate that not just internally to the staff within the hospital, but also out to the community and out to those public services. When they respond in an emergency or just general visits to the facility, we want to make sure that they're aware of what they're walking into, and that they have a clear understanding of their timing and also their accessibility to all parts of the facility. So some of the closing thoughts, the economic challenges, obviously there's a lot of inflation. We know that hospitals and health systems are dealing with reimbursement challenges. We want to make sure that, all of these things are being taken into account when we talk about strategic plans, master planning, small projects and large projects. Safety and quality of care. We can't isolate ourselves on the construction, design, and planning side from outcomes for patients. We have a direct impact on that, not only to the patients, but also to those who are administering that care. Operations, we also want to talk about efficiencies and old habits. Some of the things that we see in new spaces, both renovation and also new construction, is that without appropriate communication and involvement of end users, you have brand new spaces with the same inefficiencies because no one is, or I should say the end users are taking bad habits and workarounds and moving those forward. So with that, Angie, I thank everyone for their time. I hope this was helpful and insightful, and I will turn it back over to you.
David, thank you so much. Hats off to you. 50 minutes of CPE education is hard to do by yourself, and with a technical difficulty with a microphone, and you handled it smoothly. So hats off to you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for the opportunity.